You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 4, Arson, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 8. Traps and Snacks.
It is inadvisable to attempt to trap a dragon. Their jaws can tear through iron, and their breath can melt through granite. Any effort to trap one will yield only temporary success, followed by rapid failure and an upset dragon.
Kuro arrived dutifully for his detention at 1 o'clock sharp. Merle was already tending to the flowers in heavily patched overalls and a floppy, wide-brimmed hat. "Good afternoon. Would you like a muffin?" Kuro offered the custodian. Merle looked up from his careful pruning to glower at Kuro with scathing suspicion.
"Are you trying to bribe me so I'll treat you nicer for your detention?"
The grimace on Kuro's face answered for him.
"Too right then. Wish more students would try that."
Merle rose from his knees and stretched out his back. He picked his way carefully through the roses to fetch his treat. "Mr. Thrimpson told me to help you with the weeding," said Kuro.
"Weeding?"
Merle responded with deepest offense, bits of muffin flying from his mouth in his outrage.
"Weeding?" he repeated. "There's not a weed in this garden, I'll have you know. Wouldn't dare to grow here. See this?"
He kicked at the decorative edging around the garden, ringing the whole thing in a narrow band of gold.
"This year's enchanted up to the unmentionables. Keeps out weeds and pests. Small pests anyway, not as students. I did once propose we install something that would, but Thrimpson wouldn't go for it. Said something about negligent homicide being frowned upon by most parents."
"If I'm not weeding, what do you need me to do?" asked Kuro. If he were to waste a Saturday afternoon in detention, he wanted there to be some purpose to it.
"That might depend on whether you have another of those muffins," replied Merle.
Kuro handed him a second, which he devoured before speaking again.
"Well, you see."
The janitor paused and shuffled.
"I don't have any work at all for you. This is what you might call a bit of misdirection on the part of Mr. Thrimpson. It gets you out in an open space where you can't much run away."
It wasn't clear what kind of trap he'd walked into, but Kuro aimed to prove the man wrong. Wind roared, and he turned on his heel to flee, but it was too late. The trap had already been sprung. Someone had approached from behind, silent as a mouse and knowing not to look at Kuro directly or he'd feel their gaze. Before he'd a chance to make good his escape, they pounced. "Lovely afternoon, isn't it, Kuro?" He was caught, utterly immobilized by a net of sweet civility. "Hello, Sabine," replied Kuro, accepting his complete and utter defeat. "It's good to see you." Sabine Elisar, caseworker in charge of orphans, stood in her long lavender dress and matching headscarf, smiling. The gray uniform jacket of the administrative arm of the Royal Guard, the Ledgers, was tossed over her shoulder like a cape. It marked her as being on official business and therefore allowed her to charge travel expenses to her work. Her presence could mean only one thing. He hadn't been given a detention at all. He'd been tricked into therapy. "Would you care to join me for a chat?" she asked so gently that Kuro almost believed she would have let him refuse. Of course he didn't want to. She'd ask him horrible questions about his feelings and ambitions for which he had no good answers. He looked hopefully at Merle for aid, who gestured at a fully trimmed and entirely weed-free garden. Sabine was too nice to be rude to, and they'd made her come out here on the weekend. Absolute villains, the lot of them. "Of course," said Kuro. "I'd love to." Sabine invited him to the room in the junior high in which she met regularly with orphans. It was unchanged since his first visit, except perhaps that the leafy plant in the corner had grown to the point that it was impractical to keep in the small space. He clambered over the low coffee table and into one of the velvet armchairs. Sabine tossed her uniform in the corner and collapsed into the other chair. Kuro was to blame for the collapse. Normally, she would have gently settled, but he'd been rather inconsiderate in his method of descent from the high school plateau. While she was unrolling a magic carpet, he had thrown himself off the edge. This seemed perfectly reasonable and natural to him at the time. The wind would catch him and land him safely at the bottom. It wasn't worth pulling out his umbrella since the junior high was so close to the butte. He'd just fall and walk the rest of the way while he waited for the much slower Sabine to come down. He had failed to recognize that she might find him hurling himself off a massive cliff troubling. Everyone at the school was already used to it. As someone who cared for the well-being of children, however, she found his method of descent distressing. She was so worried that he'd just become a crater that she chased after him as fast as her rug could carry her. That pursuit, and the relief of finding him whole and unsplattered, had left her a bit shaky. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked. "You know, I'm supposed to be the one asking you that," she replied. "Oh, I'm fine," Kuro said. "Never better, really." "Really? That's good to hear." Sabine was trying to reclaim the gentleness of temper and sweetness of tone she usually employed. "Mr. Thrimson was quite worried for you." "It's silly for people to start worrying about me now. I can say and do whatever I want without my curse killing me." That did not, broadly speaking, comfort Sabine. If anything, it seemed to worry her as much as his earlier plummet. "You say that very casually." Misplaced worry in Kuro's view. All the old orders from Phineas had been released. The promises to Bindle about teaching him magic and not eating gluten had been fulfilled. He just had one to Dubois about not telling anyone how to smuggle gold into the Blandlands, and the one to the dragon. Those were easy to navigate, relatively speaking. "I'm fine." She wrestled to restrain a look of doubt. It didn't so much question his sincerity, but his perspective, as though he were honestly claiming to be happy and healthy while being actively devoured by a crocodile. Maybe that was the normal expression for her. He wouldn't know. This was the first real conversation in which he'd been able to look her in the eye without dropping dead on the spot. "You know, sometimes it can be good to talk things out with someone," Sabine said, working hard to soften her eyes and struggling to sound at ease. "So you don't have to carry it all yourself." She had come all this way on a weekend, Kuro thought, and he wished her no ill will. She was a wonderful lady, despite her association with the guard. Fighting his own instincts to never tell anyone anything, he would give her what she asked for, and in doing so, convince her to stop worrying. He explained how he was no longer bound by the orders Phineas had given him, so he could do anything from conversation to theft without simply dying. He can even talk about the murder he witnessed as a child without consequences. It had been ages since he'd been forced to go a day without food, nor could he remember the last time he'd had to wash himself in the slushy outflow of a downspout. Often, he slept whole nights without nightmares of the experiments of which he'd been the subject. Nobody had tried to kill, maim, or arrest him in months. His bones had set well, and the scars had healed cleanly. The headaches from his various concussions hardly bothered him. He was even doing well in some of his classes, the forced labor of his youth turning out to be useful for something. After spending the vast majority of his life unlikely to survive another week, he could reasonably foresee living to the following summer. He was doing great. All this failed to comfort Sabine at all. In fact, rather than easing her worry, every story he provided explaining how well he was doing just seemed to deepen the furrow in her brow. By the end, it looked like she'd followed him through a war zone. He wasn't sure why she was so troubled, though. She had been right. Talking it out had made him feel better. It reminded him how good things were right now. After what felt like much too long a pause, Sabine said, "I might come back to check on you more regularly this year. Just for my own sake." "You don't need to do that," he argued. "I'm fine. I'm sure other people need you more." "Have you considered, Kuro, that you have had a difficult life? People can get used to a lot of things, and maybe what you've come to accept as normal would send many people running for the hills?" "Well, I didn't really have a choice," said Kuro. Sabine mustered a smile. "Yes, well, now that you do, I would like to help you imagine continuing to make them well beyond next summer." Kuro shrugged. He couldn't stop her, and he didn't really mind her visits, except that they took time away from homework and cooking. Cooking he really needed to get to. He had snacks to prepare. They decided to bring some Autumn Lodge snacks to the Abuse of Authority night. Against all probability, Marie and Arthur complained of missing the food from their old residence. Kuro made some all-dressed chips. Charlie brought some maple bacon cookies, which Kuro also made. She had fully intended to help, but one of her first years was having a quantity of feelings about an upcoming test that couldn't fit inside their small body. Charlie needed to help them contain the overflow. One of the challenges with young wizards, and a key reason they're kept on an isolated island for most of the year, is that they hadn't yet learned how not to do magic. Excessive emotional outpourings usually just resulted in small fires or warped floorboards. A particularly imaginative student in the throes of a panic attack, though, could conjure all manner of nastiness. On that evening, for example, they were grappling with several gallons of ambulatory lime jelly. They ended up being late because Charlie had to change her outfit and do her hair again. These were both actions that confused Kuro. The Charlie he knew would have just removed most of the citrus ooze via magic and called it good enough. That evening, she fully washed her hair and put on crisp, clean clothes. Moreover, she changed out of one skirt and into another. He hadn't even known she owned 2 skirts. He was pretty sure she was wearing makeup, too. "You look nice," observed Kuro. It left his mouth sounding more like an accusation than a compliment. He found himself suddenly quite agitated, and he wasn't certain if it was because she had dressed up or because he hadn't. Was he wrong to think that nothing had changed and they could just be themselves? Or was she right in recognizing that things had? "Do I?" She seemed relieved somehow. "Oh, good, I wasn't sure. I'm not really practiced at it, you know? There isn't much need to on the farm, because chickens and drakes don't really care how you look, and nobody wants to muck out a stall in a skirt, especially one that shows your knees. You want loose jeans that will fit outside your rubber boots." "Why?" interrupted Kuro. "Because all sorts of things will fall down inside if you don't. Let me tell you, a boot full of hydra dung is no walk in the park. That stuff burns the skin and stains something awful." "No, I mean, why did you dress up?" Kuro had to interrupt again before he got a complete accounting of the aromatic qualities of every kind of manure imaginable. The question had the unexpected effect of shutting her up. Her mouth kept moving, but for several seconds no words came out. "Well, thought I might want to try something different for a change." "Is it because Marie's a queen now?" "Yes," said Charlie, a bit too enthusiastically. It was almost as if she liked his reason better than whatever one she hadn't been saying. "You can't visit a queen in grubby farm clothes." He hoped she was wrong. His outfit for this audience with royalty included his comfiest jeans and t-shirt. As all the most comfortable clothes are, they were secondhand, threadbare, and patched. He would have liked to interrogate her more, but they'd reached the doors to Summerhill. Belladonna and Sir McCool met them and embarked on the inspection required of anyone getting close to the Queen. They were mostly performative. It didn't really matter if they carried knives or explosives, given that they were both wizards. If knights wanted to stop them bringing anything dangerous into the room with them, they'd need to confiscate their brains. While effective, that would somewhat spoil the mood of the evening. They did find 2 bags of suspicious contraband requiring close scrutiny. "Potato chips and cookies," said Bella. "Could be poisoned." "We should confirm that it's safe," said Craig. Before there was a chance to warn them, each had taken a bite. Their faces twisted in the shock of misplaced expectations. Bella was frozen in confusion as the sweetness of the maple in the cookie contrasted with the saltiness of the bacon and the tartness of the dried cranberries. She chewed slowly, deciding whether the adventure in her mouth was one she enjoyed. Craig, though, was nearly convulsing as the waves of unanticipated flavor in the chip overwhelmed him. He grimaced while his eyes took an turn to blink away tears. His jaw hung open as though he hoped if he left his mouth wide enough, his tongue might leave and thereby end his misery. Kuro grabbed a chip himself and confirmed that they were still crisp, fresh, and flavorful. He thought these were the best he'd made to date. It was a Luton recipe, and there was as much art as science involved in getting the balance right. It was easy to overdo the salt or pepper, or go soggy from too much lime, slimy from too much blue cheese, or sticky from an excess of jelly bean. He was particularly proud of how well the anchovy complemented the jalapeno in this batch. "They're an Autumn Lodge indelicacy, all dressed chips," Charlie informed them as she floated one out of the oil-soaked paper bag they occupied and into her mouth. "Oh, these are good this time. Is that a hint of cocoa?" she said as she chewed. "I thought it would contrast well with the kimchi," said Kuro. Craig presented a chip, a particularly heavily seasoned chip, to Bella. More than a dare, It was a challenge, a test of her bravery and resolve, her very honor as a knight. She scowled, clearly weighing mutiny or desertion against subjecting herself to the innocent potato chip. Pride won the day, and she snatched the snack from his grasp and put the whole thing in her mouth. Her armor poured out of her obsidian bracelets, expanding by reflex to defend her from what her body interpreted as a potentially lethal assault. It was probably for the best that it did, because the helmet helped muffle some of the profanity. Charlie and Kuro were, eventually, led to the second-floor lounge. A sign stated that the room was reserved for Her Majesty the Queen's private salon, which sounded very posh. The effect was only slightly diminished by the fact that the sign was roughly scrawled on plain paper and taped to the door. The pair of large armed knights who would be standing outside added a measure of legitimacy to the claim, though. The room felt inappropriately fancy for them, all Persian rugs and heavy brocade curtains. It was wrong for them to hang out together in a room with wainscoting and upholstery that didn't itch. Despite the finery, it did contain the required elements for an evening of dedicated irresponsibility. Sofas for lounging, a table for cards, and a fire for making popcorn later. And critically, it contained an Arthur and a Marie. It also contained an Azalea and a Moira. The pair of little sisters sat at a table in the corner, covered in loose-leaf paper, blunted pencils, and thick books. Kuro resisted the urge to accuse them of invading their private engagement and generally ruining the atmosphere by their mere presence. He must not have hidden his feelings well enough because Marie explained their attendance. "They're doing homework," she said. "They had to skip a grade to be my guards, so the least I can do is help them catch up. Besides, what's an evening in the lounge together without someone trying to study nearby and constantly shushing us?" "We thank you for your generosity, Your Majesty," said Moira, looking up from her piles of notes and texts. "No, you don't, you liar," responded Marie with a laugh. "You'd rather be doing anything other than numerology on a Saturday night." A part of Moira, the knightly part full of honor, seemed ready to contest the slight against her. She squared her shoulders, puffed her chest, and raised her chin in prideful defiance. The 15-year-old girl in her, the one overwhelmed and exhausted with the simultaneous demands of duty and school, swept in and evaporated her will to fight. She slumped and let herself fall face first into the textbook in front of her. Auburn hair pooled around her while she enacted the ritual attempted by every student at some point, hoping that knowledge would seep directly from the pages into her head by mere contact with the book. It worked no better for wizards than Blandlanders, but they tried just the same. Being the more bookish of the pair, Azalea was still attempting to read in the more traditional way, via the eyes. Seeing her sister in arms conceding defeat, her resolve was flagging. She looked to Kuro with silent pleading. Pleading for what he didn't know, maybe for help with math, but he was the last person in the room to offer that kind of aid. More likely, she wanted him to do something violent or criminal, and allow her to escape her academic duties and pursue her knightly ones. "I can help if you want," offered Charlie to the girls. All 6 eyes of her friends fell on her, taking it in turn to express silent shock, confusion, or disbelief. Charlotte Cook, whom they had previously had to tie to a chair to keep her from running away from her own studies, was offering tutoring services on a night off. It defied all reason. She was also standing strangely, thrusting out one hip and extending the opposite leg while absently fidgeting with her hair. She looked like she was trying to pose for the cover of a fashion magazine, but had only ever read about how it was done, so she ended up looking strained and awkward. The earnestness of her attempt made it hilarious. Kuro wasn't sure what Charlie was trying to accomplish, but he thought it best to intervene before anyone started laughing. "We brought snacks," he said, slicing through the growing awkwardness in the room with the edge of a chip. "Are those what I think they are?" demanded Marie, snatching the paper bag from Kuro before he had a chance to answer. She fell back onto a sofa in rapturous glory as the first chip hit her tongue. "I can't believe I missed these." "What did you bring?" asked Moira, curious enough to give up on absorbing knowledge from her book via osmosis and raise her head. Marie smiled with predatory delight. "You, my young knights, are about to experience a closely held secret of Autumn Lodge." She slithered off the couch and padded over to the table where they worked. "Arthur, would you mind? The changeling nodded and started to pace out the edge of the room, walking slowly and deliberately. When Arthur had finished his loop of the lounge, the quality of the air shifted ever so slightly, and sound seemed to struggle to move through it. This was a favorite spell of Dubois. It kept noise from leaving the space, keeping secret conversations private, although it could be turned to more nefarious purposes, concealing the sounds of suffering. Few outsiders have had the pleasure. You should feel honored. Marie placed a single chip in front of each of them as though she was handling live explosives. Both girls steeled themselves for what was an obvious trap as they picked up their chip. It was a gift from their queen. They could not refuse. In unison, the brave knights bit down and chewed. Azalea gagged and scrambled for water, which Charlie had known to prepare, while Marie presented the chips. She'd gone through this with her first-year lodgers just a week earlier. Moira, though, chewed happily and provided feedback. These are quite nice, less fishy than the ones Dad makes, and the minty molasses aftertaste is quite smooth. Azalea managed to find time between gulps of water and her overwhelming misery to look aghast at her comrade. She might have made some accusation questioning the girl's honesty or sanity, but her mouth was failing to form words. Marie cackled with delight at Azalea's misery as Kuro gave her a much less challenging cookie as something of an apology. The young knight regarded it with deep misgivings, however. Having been betrayed once already that evening, she was reluctant to risk it again. Other than torturing your knights, how goes the queening? Asked Kuro. It's so boring. The answer burst out of Marie's mouth as though it had been desperate to be heard. Almost all of it is settling pointless squabbles between people who are too rich and important to think for themselves. Last week, I genuinely had to adjudicate the naming rights of a dog. Lord Misanthrope and Lady Twitswilling both named their new puppies Akinwande on the same day in my honor. And then thought about who did it first. Not that it's much of an honor to have a pug named after you. That's Lord Misanthrope and Lady Twistwilling, Your Majesty, corrected Moira helpfully. Not any more. I changed the titles until they both pick a new name for their ugly dogs. Marie threw herself onto a sofa and lamented the folly of the nobility around a mouthful of chips. They went 16 years without a queen, and now they can't seem to wipe their own butts without a royal decree. They should be embarrassed. Anyway, I don't want to talk about that tonight. I want to hear from you. What's going on at the lodge? How are the new kids? Why is Charlie wearing eyeliner? You know, normal stuff. And then, for a little while, things were normal. Or at least what they imagined normal to be. It was the sort of normal that had only been achieved while nobody was buried in homework, badly injured, or being kidnapped, arrested, or accused of crimes. These were brief and fleeting moments in their collective history. Marie and Charlie gabbed, complaining about teachers and gossiping about fellow students, while Kuro and Arthur contributed nearly nothing. They showed off the magic they were learning to each other. Marie pulled out an enchanted pen she had made, whose ink would stop flowing if a word was being misspelt. Arthur impressed everyone by being able to impersonate Marie so completely that he could even conjure a copy of her raven familiar. Charlie sculpted Smoke into a fluffy white dog, which was impressive. When she was told as much by the girls doing their homework, she lost focus and the smoke dog burst, filling the room with sooty remains. Marie let them have a good look at her magical armor. It flowed out from a pair of enchanted cuffs and covered her head to toe in plates of gold, fashioned to resemble a dragon. The armor had a horned helmet with a fanged visor, taloned gauntlets, and a pair of bat-like wings which were somehow simultaneously metallic and leathery. It was the greatest suit of armor in the Summer Kingdom, possibly the world. Lord and master over all the lesser ones worn by the knights. The armor was impregnable, indestructible, and, by Marie's report, had built-in air conditioning. It was so heavily enchanted that it nearly had a mind of its own and would automatically expand to defend her from an assault she couldn't even see coming. Marie regretted informing them of this because she kept having her conversation interrupted by the suit expanding to defend her from terrible threats like flicked coins and thrown erasers. They spoke of home and family. Being high school students, they obviously were much too mature to be homesick. So instead, they expressed their concern for parents, siblings, and monsters missing them. Marie lamented how hard it had been for her father to learn that his daughter was a secret wizard princess, and that he still didn't know that the rest of his children were changelings. Charlie fretted about how hard it would be for her dad to manage the new clutch of cockatrices without her. Arthur even expressed concern about what his mother would do now that she'd retired from being a knight so that Moira could take up her armor. They played cards, which Quirrell lost despite cheating. They laughed. They ate too much. They soaked in each other's company. And then, with a knock at the door, it was over. "I'm very sorry to interrupt," said Sir McCool, poking his head into the room. It sounded like he meant it. "There's an urgent letter from the palace which needs your attention." "Of course, Craig. Could you just close the door for a moment? I'd like to say goodnight to my friends," Marie said, full of forgiveness and understanding. She turned to Arthur. "Is the sound dampening still active?" Arthur nodded. "Lady Lamorak, Lady Omirius, you are not to repeat what you hear here," she ordered her junior knights as she claimed the tiara she'd left on the side table. They saluted their obedience. And then Her Majesty, the Queen of the Summer Kingdom of Tir na Nog, screamed. She stomped and swore with such rage and color that the young pair went pale. "One night," she said between profanities. "Can't they take care of themselves and not bother me for a single night? I bet it's some life or death problem, like who has the right to wear teal shoelaces on Tuesdays, or the rightful owner of a boat that sank a century ago. And where do you think you two are going?" She snarled at Moira and Azalea, who were packing their bags. "We were going to follow you, my liege," replied Moira hopefully. "Not unless you finished all of the review questions," scolded Marie in her most queenly voice. "I'll not have my knights failing their classes." The girls sat back down, humbled. Quirrell was impressed at how quickly Marie could flip from expletive-laden tantrum to commanding royalty. Marie took some deep breaths and forced herself into something like a queenly composure while she settled the tiara on her head. "Same time next week?" she asked hopefully. She received a collection of sympathetic affirmations from her friends and swept off with regal grace to attend to whatever inane demand was being placed on her. The three friends were left to their own devices in the lounge, presumably welcome to stay to keep snacking and chatting, though they all felt a bit strange enjoying themselves while Marie worked. A groan of academic despair from Moira enacted some strange magic, summoning Charlie to her side. She abandoned the boys without hesitation to offer aid to the young lady in distress, providing the wisdom her superior age granted. On their own, Arthur and Quirrell were at a bit of a loss. Their habit in previous years would be to sit in an agreeable state of mutual silence and then go to sleep early. That tradition had been supported by having nothing much to say to each other. They'd shared almost every minute of every day together. From breakfast to bedtime, they were rarely out of earshot. There was no news to share, no thoughts the other couldn't predict. With the rift in residences and course schedules, they had so much to share but little practice at sharing it. "How's stuff?" asked Quirrell, attempting to reach across the gap. "Mostly good," said Arthur, with the familiar monotone he applied when not pretending to be someone else. A lengthy pause followed, the kind of silence the pair were used to, that is, one filled by the background noise of Charlie talking, although in this case she was explaining how to isolate interplanar singularities instead of her favorite books or a cool bug she saw. Azalea gazed across the room, locking eyes with Quirrell with a look of desperation. Madness. If she wanted help with her homework, she should ask Charlie, who was already there and seemed more than willing. She was so eager to help she was practically sharing a chair with Moira and seemed flush from the excitement of teaching. Lacking the skill to bridge gently from small talk into serious matters of life and death, Quirrell said something that had been on his mind all night, but that he had stayed silent about. Marie had demanded an evening of frivolity, and this wasn't that. It was paranoia. "Do you think any of the teachers might be a Roche copy?" "No," said Arthur with a lack of intonation that made him seem confident about it. "What about the principal?" "Definitely not, but I can see why you would think so. His office is similar to the Regent's, and he wears that headband, but not at night." Quirrell had expected to have to spend time explaining his accusations. He had expected pushback and skepticism, assertions that he was being paranoid. There was a whole speech prepared to justify his suspicions. He'd even come up with the phrase, aesthetic resonances, which he thought sounded quite impressive and convincing, and now he'd have no reason to use it. With Arthur already fully briefed on the matter, Kuro had nothing left to say. There were no arguments to make or exciting speculation to be had. They'd have to return to the dreadful realm of small talk. Kuro was so disappointed that he almost missed a key detail of what Arthur had said. "How do you know he takes off the headband at night? Are you spying on teachers in their sleep?" he asked. "What are you, a black coat?" The reply was not what it should have been. Any normal person under that accusation would have dismissed it as a bit of whimsy. They would explain how they happened upon Mr. Thrimpson after hours without the headband or some such mundane and reasonable thing. Arthur, though, ignored the real question, attending instead to the last 3 words. He responded quickly, crisply, and earnestly, as though he'd practiced 1,000 times in the mirror with, "There's no such thing." Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.